Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Cole. It's Sunday afternoon, March 19th. Coming back from spring break now. I hope everybody had an enjoyable spring break. We're now heading into week 2 of Political Science 1013 on the second 8-week schedule for the spring 2023 term. Every 1 hour exam is now Sunday the 19th as I'm speaking to you. Our exam will be this Saturday the 25th, all day for 24 hours. We'll do you all day on Saturday. 50 multiple choice and 2 false items based on units 1 and 2 of the course, according to the syllabus on political participation and then political parties and pressure groups. Okay, so mostly 2 false items, some multiple choice, largely based on the class notes for those 2 units, plus 10 or 15 items on some additional outside readings I've asked you to do. And the links to those were supplied in an announcement that went out right at the beginning of the term. So that will be this Saturday, the 25th, all day for 24 hours. 50 items, 2 points each, 100-point exam. Once again, over units 1 and 2. And in addition to that, the class notes for units 1 and 2, and 4 additional readings to be accessed online that I mentioned in the announcement that went out right at the beginning of the term a couple of weeks ago now. All right, so what we want to do is say a little bit about Unit 2 on parties and pressure groups, because we tried to address Unit 1 before. So we'll try to very briefly run through what we try to emphasize in Unit 2. Also say a word about those readings before we go today. All right, so there are a few things we're trying to accomplish in Unit 2. We begin with some preliminary information about parties in general and the American parties in particular. Then we jump into the question of why there are only 2 major political parties. Because in many other countries you'll find more than 2 parties with considerable influence over the political system. But there are only 2, the Democrats and the Republicans, that go back a long way before the Civil War in the case of both of them, and in the case of the Democrats, almost all the way to the beginning of the country. Right? Why there are only 2 major parties really is a matter of what we might call the rules of the game. Okay, we try to discuss in those class notes how the rules are set up to give an advantage to the 2 biggest parties. Different rules would perhaps create a better chance for perhaps 2 or 3 or more parties in addition to the biggest 2. But that's not the way we write our rules of the game. We try to go through some examples, talk about how things work in different countries and some of the sorts of political parties we see in countries with systems and rules of the game different than our own. But we write the rules of the game in a particular way, and that tends to give an advantage to the 2 biggest political parties. And it turns out that any other parties that might try to form more than likely won't have much of a chance unless we change the rules. Okay, so be sure you understand that. After that, we go through the history of these 2 political parties, going back almost a century, from the 1930s to today, I would say. It really comes to about 90 years. We talk about the ins and outs of the political parties, the growth that they have undergone, the kinds of people that have supported them, which has undergone some shifts through the years, okay, and where the political parties stand today, about 1/4 of the way through the 21st century, as compared to back in the 1930s, the period of World War II, the New Deal, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt, when many scholars would say the 2 parties took on many of the characteristics they have today. So we try to trace what happened to the parties from then until now. And we try to give a description of the kinds of people who support each party. We go through the 90 years of history of the parties, and we look at which parties have been on top during those periods. There's been a number of shifts, as well as shifts in the kind of people that support each of the 2 political parties. But we go through a fair amount of the recent history of the parties in that unit. Then the last 1/3 or so of those class notes are devoted to pressure groups instead of parties. Interest groups or pressure groups, they're called. Sometimes they are referred to as lobbies because lobbying is an activity they engage in. But among political scientists, the labels pressure group or interest group have caught on in recent times. And these are organizations, there are perhaps hundreds or thousands of them rather than just two major political parties. But they try to influence the system somewhat in a similar way to what the political parties try to do, but much narrower in their scope than the two major political parties who have to try to speak for the country as a whole to one extent or another. Very often what pressure groups are after is the economic interests of their members. That's not true in each and every case of a pressure group, but most of the groups trying to function in the system, by and large, most of them are there in pursuit of the economic interests of their members. And we try to go through several categories of pressure groups so that you'll be familiar with the major, more important pressure groups that try to exercise influence in our country these days, right? Most, but not all of them, are aimed at augmenting the economic interests of their members. Okay. Some try to take up other purposes than that, but most of the groups in the pressure group system we would describe as being after the economic interests of their members. We talk about the kinds of activities that pressure groups engage in, which include public relations and advertising, also campaign contributions to politicians and political parties, but perhaps above all else, lobbying or direct contact with public officials. And with regard to the federal government, this often, what would often come to mind would be a professional lobbyist, a paid lobbyist, making contact with a member of the United States Congress, or perhaps someone on that member's staff in Washington, D.C. Okay. Lobbying can take other forms. It goes on in the state capitals as well. When we talk about the federal government, that's largely what we're talking about. Now, we have the impression of lobbying as corrupt, but one thing to note is that you'll notice with professional lobbyists who would defend their profession, they would emphasize that much of what they're out to do, as opposed to, say, handing money under the table, which we may associate with lobbyists, but they'll say that much of their activity is devoted to providing accurate information to actors in the political system, members of Congress and member staff as well. So gathering and provision of information, they would say, is a big part of what they do. All right, so political parties and pressure groups. Now, to look very briefly at those four readings, in addition to the class notes for Units 1 and 2 that you're assigned for the exam on Saturday, you have one fairly lengthy article that will go back to Unit 1, which questions whether Americans are really participating sufficiently in the democratic system. Then you have three more that address the state of the political parties to one degree or another. And actually, in this case, what we're looking at for the exam, all three touch on the Republicans to one degree or another. You have an article by an Associated Press writer who visited conservative Republican voters in Wisconsin to try to get an idea of what's on their minds these days. So see what you think of that. You might find it concerning, you might find it alarming, or perhaps reflective of what you yourself think. But take a look at that. You have an article about Trump and just how far, how strong the extent of support is among Trump supporters within the Republican Party. How big a block do they make up within the party? Okay, is it possible for any other candidate to overcome that support and get the 2024 presidential nomination away from Donald Trump? Okay. As I'm recording this statement, it's just been reported this weekend that Trump has stated he may be arrested Tuesday, and he's asking his supporters to organize protest of some kind. The arrest may very well involve, I suspect it will, the indictment of Mr. Trump regarding an illegal hush money payment that was made a number of years ago. So we'll see whether that takes place or not. But you'll notice one of the articles you have to read is about Trump and his influence within the Republican Party. The final article we have to read is about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a pressure group. It's the organization that is the biggest organization to represent small and middle-sized business interests in the United States. And we might think they would lean more to the Republicans than the Democrats, and they probably do, but you'll notice they're sort of on the outs with the House Republican leadership. So that's discussed in the article that we've assigned to you about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Now, everybody, look for an additional email from me. I'll try to get this out perhaps this evening, Sunday, or no later than Monday, in which I will try to discuss some things that have happened with regard to those readings and maybe clarify some of what's in those readings a little bit for you. Other than that, the exam material will be, by and large, the class notes for Units 1 and 2, plus expect 10 or 15 items on those 4 articles you were assigned that are to be accessed online. The links to those were supplied in an announcement that went out a couple of weeks ago. If you have any trouble accessing any of that, or if you have a question about any other problem or issue you might have leading up to the exam, contact me through the course website or at david.cole@opsu.edu. And we'll be talking to you once again about a week from now at this time, at which time the exam on Saturday will be over, and we'll be getting ready for exam 2. So study hard for that exam, and we'll talk to you again a week from now at this time.